For parents, alcohol and drug addiction is an issue that we all need to be mindful of. Addiction is an issue that can affect anybody, but men and boys are more likely to fall into the trappings of excessive alcohol and drug consumption. In the UK, men are nearly 3 times as likely as women to become dependent on alcohol. Approximately 4.3% of men are dependent on drugs, and men account for about 74% of hospital admissions for drug-related mental and behavioural disorders. To explore all of this and help us understand what we can do to support our boys and the young people around us, we are delighted to be joined by Jessica Lahey. Jessica writes about education, parenting and child welfare for The Atlantic, The Washington Post and The New York Times. Jessica is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Gift of Failure: How the Best Parents Learn to Let Go So Their Children Can Succeed. She lives in sunny Vermont with her husband and 2 children, and her second book, The Addiction Inoculation: Raising Healthy Kids in a Culture of Dependence, is out now. Jessica, we are so excited to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
I am so happy to be here. I'm grateful to anyone who opens up this conversation. It can be an intimidating conversation. It can be a scary conversation. Some people find, that they'd rather not think about it. So I'm really, really grateful to anyone who's willing to open this conversation up.
So in reading your book and doing a bit of research, I went on your Instagram and there were 2 things I noticed: a lot of books and a lot of dogs. So is animal photography like a side hustle for you? Is it something that you do on the side?
I find my dogs to be fairly photogenic, and I make it very, very clear that my content will tend to be a lot. I also host a podcast called the #AmWriting Podcast with 3 of my best friends. And so we have a lot of book content on there because the whole podcast is about being an author and the writing life and all of that sort of stuff. And I work at home. So, and my kids don't live at home anymore. So what else am I going to photograph? So you'll get some garden content in the summer because I'm studying to be a master gardener, and my dogs, they're here. They're my office mates. So,
Well, we all have dogs on this podcast, so you're in good company.
Excellent.
So Jessica, addiction it can impact everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And the effects are devastating for the whole community, the family. That being said, men and boys are more likely to develop an addiction to drugs and alcohol. Can you talk to us about why that is?
So here's a really interesting, I was actually going to address this fairly early on, is that the numbers right now for adolescents anyway in the US are flipped to what you're discussing. So at this point, what we're seeing just recently, actually, some numbers came out in the US and we're having this wonderful decline that's been going on for well over a decade, around 15 years now, of drug and alcohol use among adolescents. But among girls, really the numbers of girls drinking has gone up slightly. And it's a little concerning. And when you get into the topic of why kids are drinking, we classically as parents, we're like, oh, peer pressure. You got to keep those kids away from those dangerous friends that are going to lure them into drug and alcohol use. Well, when you ask adolescents why they're using, why they, initiate drug or alcohol use, they talk about stress and they talk about anxiety actually as a bigger factor than peer group. And while peer group still is a really important part of talking about risk, kids are more likely to use if their friends are using, obviously. They're more likely to use if their siblings are using, that sort of thing. But when it comes to numbers in the US, and especially among girls, they cite anxiety as one of the reasons that they take up drugs and alcohol. Also, when you look at the numbers in the US, there are some really interesting patterns of why people use and how dangerous that is for their long-term susceptibility to substance use disorder. For a kid who's maybe drinking because they don't like themselves very much and they want to escape from that, or they're really anxious and they want to escape from that, and they begin to use that drug and withdraw from society, that seems to be, relatively speaking, more dangerous for that kid than the sort of kid who goes out and drinks just at parties to sort of elevate an already, what they're already feeling great about. So, kids use for a lot of different reasons, and it always stuns me that it's taken us a long time to actually ask them why they're using. The other thing that I should bring up is that one of the things you there need to know about is that, the European Union as a whole has the highest rates of disease attributable to alcohol and death attributable to alcohol in the entire world. This is coming from World Health Organization, Europe information. And there's variation between different countries within the European Union. Obviously, you're not, but they tend to talk about the UK as part of that when you're looking at drinking statistics. And some countries have lower rates of substance use disorder than others, or lower rates of death and a disease attributable to alcohol, whereas in the UK it's really, really high numbers. As someone, I went to Oxford University for 2 summers, and the drinking culture there, and I have family over there. I spent a lot of time there, lived in London for a while. The drinking culture there is really strong. Culture tends to beget, the culture is created by behavior, but it also tends to dictate behavior. And it's really powerful when you're talking about why people drink and the patterns and the amount that they're drinking. So, I can't speak specifically to why the numbers in the UK reflect that boys are drinking at higher numbers, except to say that culture tends to beget behavior, and just as behavior begets culture. You see a lot of drinking around sports, for example, in the US. With American football, so much money is poured into the advertising of alcohol. If you look at like how much it costs to put advertisements, at the 50-yard line right in the middle there, that's a really expensive thing. But brand loyalty is incredibly profitable for companies. So when you look at European football or soccer, there's a lot of alcohol that is advertised, whether it's rugby, whether it's soccer, and that can dictate behavior as well. And expectations, when you tailgate, when you go to games, you drink, and that's just what you do. That sort of behavior can affect uses as well.
Yeah. Do you have I'd be really interested in the UK data on it, because I mean, we love a drink, right? In the UK, we're obsessed with drinking. And if you're not drinking when you go out, people look at you like you're a leper. Like, what? You don't have you drink? What? Why? Why would you not have a drink? But I've noticed with the younger generation that they seem to be drinking, from my observations without having any data, they seem to be drinking a lot less than certainly I did when I was younger. Do you know if it's decreasing or is it the same?
So what we're seeing here especially is a huge explosion in non-alcoholic beverages. Like if you look at, mocktails and non-alcoholic beer, which, can be kind of hit or miss. I did a review of non-alcoholic craft beers for the Washington Post food section a couple of years ago, and I drank all of them that I could find. And now there's like 3 times as many as there was then. It's incredible how that industry has sort of expanded. When you look at the people who are opting out of drinking, whether it's like sober October or dry January, the numbers have really gone up. I think there are a lot of reasons for that. I think social media, while it can also it can really also promote drug and alcohol use, it has an incredible power, at least in this country, of highlighting a bunch of celebrities who have opted not to drink or use. And it can be a place where people can talk really openly and reduce some of the shame and stigma around, deciding whether you have an issue with it or not, whether you have substance use disorder, as I do. I'm an alcoholic. Wow, there's a lot, we know a lot more now about the impact that ethanol can have on the human body. It is a carcinogen. There's a whole bunch of negative impacts that alcohol can have on the human body. And so for some people, they're like, well, I don't necessarily have a problem with alcohol, but it's not, if I'm eliminating other carcinogens from my diet, why not think about those as well? So I think social media has had a big impact on it. I know prevention works when we help educate kids about the impact of drugs and alcohol on their body, on their thinking, on the fact that their brains are still evolving and developing until the early to mid 20s, and things that you do to your body and your brain, especially during that period of like incredible plasticity of the brain up until the early to mid 20s. The impacts you make on your brain then it's a lot riskier. Drug and alcohol use during adolescence is much, much riskier than drug and alcohol use in adulthood, once your brain has sort of settled into its cognitive development and it's sort of, the doors close a little bit, not all the way, but close a little bit on cognitive development. So things that can have like a moderate to low risk in adulthood can have moderate to high risk in adolescence and can be permanent. So I won't get into all the research, but there are parts of your brain, the part, for example, that handles short-term memory. For kids who are, for example, using cannabis on a frequent basis, can have smaller hippocampuses, the memory part of the brain, the part that processes short-term memory and emotional memory. That part of the brain can be smaller in kids that use a lot of cannabis. So we have this incredible ability now with like functional MRIs and PET scans to look at the brain and look to see what those substances are doing to the brain. And alcohol just acts differently in a young body and brain and can have permanent impact. So giving kids that information to make more informed decisions is really, really important. But I do have to say, to your point, that having spent a fair amount of time in England, and especially during vacations, like for example, going to the Isle of Wight during the summer, the drinking started noon on the dot and went straight through to pre-dinner drinks and then drinking at dinner and then going to the pub after dinner. And this was before I had a real problem with alcohol, and I just couldn't keep up. There was no way. And, having visited as a teacher, as a longtime teacher, I tend to have a teacherly/maternal feeling towards adolescents. And I would see kids just passed out on the side of the road. And my first instinct is to go over to make sure they're still breathing and don't have alcohol poisoning. And, we tend not to see that as much in the US and in some other countries in the European Union. So it's been interesting to look at the patterns in places like the UK, which have actually in some areas improved things a little bit. I think the public health messaging has gotten better.
Yeah, it's only when I started traveling overseas that I actually realized that the UK had a drinking culture as bad as it is. What do you think about like accessibility and pricing? So when I was at uni, we could go out with like £8 and you're good, because two double Red Bull and vodkas was about £1.50. So you can leave your house with like a £10 note and you're drunk for the night. Like, is that still the case?
Well, I think it was also accessibility in terms of, we have pretty stringent rules here around kids under the age where, here it's 21, there it's 18. At 21 here, if you try to buy alcohol under the age of 21, the place that sells it, there's pretty stringent rules around it. And if you get caught selling alcohol to kids under the age of 21, they'll close you down. Whereas, having spent time there, it was easier under the age of 18 to get a hold of drinks if you wanted them. And save for places like Japan, for example, where they have vending machines on the streets where you can get alcohol, and you're supposed to not do it before a certain age, but it's a vending machine. What are you going to do? Or here during COVID, a lot of the rules were relaxed around home delivery of alcohol because people couldn't go out. And those rules have stayed expanded and relaxed. And there has been a huge increase, a pretty big increase in the number of, in the amount of drinking that adults sort of 19 to 30 are doing. And some of that is attributable, it's believed to be attributable to the ease of getting alcohol delivered to your house. And it's really hard to do efficient carding of people to make sure that, it's not, that it is someone over the age of 21 who's getting that home delivery of alcohol. So I really do think that good rules around enforcement of age laws around drinking can help, but it can be difficult to do that. I think in the US, we're getting a handle on that, save for this whole home delivery thing. And that's important. And the other thing that you haven't even brought up that I think is really interesting is that the violence here, we're so worried about gun violence, and gun violence, as we should be because it's ridiculous. Gun violence is strongly tied into alcohol use, and those two things can be linked. And so it turns out that if you crack down on alcohol, alcohol limits at places like that, or the hours of the day where you can buy alcohol. In Baltimore, for example, they reduced the hours in the day that alcohol outlets could be open, and they reduced the amount of gun violence that was going on at night in those places as well. It was really interesting legislation and the impact that it had. So I think that there's a lot we can do around culture. And remember when I said that, behavior begets culture and culture begets behavior. So when I mentioned that the European Union as a whole has the higher rates, there are certain countries that don't. And those tend to be countries where the culture is that you don't get falling over drunk in public, that's just not acceptable. So for example, Italy has one of the higher rates rates of daily drinking, but one of the lower rates of, sort of a really acute binge drinking, which is fascinating to me that it's just in that culture and in cultures, places like especially Southern Europe, it's just not cool to get that drunk and be falling over drunk in public, whereas it is socially acceptable in places like the UK to be falling over drunk in public.
It is.
Yeah.
How can you tell if you're concerned about your child potentially having an addiction? How can you tell? I had a friend in my teenage years. I think it's probably started when I was like 15 up until the early 20s. And he was in my friendship group, close friend. And we would drink on a Friday, Saturday night. We'd go out, we'd go to a friend's house and we'd all get drunk, but he would always take it further. He'd always buy his own bottle of brandy. It was an E&J brandy. I remember the bottle. And he'd drink it straight from the bottle, no mixer. And he'd finish the whole thing in a couple of hours. And by the end of the night, he was either like on the floor, slurring his words or getting into trouble. It was quite embarrassing. And sometimes it was actually quite dangerous as well for all of us. And it was only kind of years later that I thought, actually, he's probably an alcoholic. At the time, I don't think I realized, didn't have the language. What does it look like if you're worried about your child potentially having an addiction? What are sort of the things you should be looking for?
Well, the good news is that overall, the things that you need to look for in kids that would signal, I need to start talking to my kid are similar with alcohol, drugs, mental health issues, all that kind of stuff. Change in your kid is a big one. Change in their behavior, change in their sleep patterns, all of that is really, really important. Alcohol and sleep have a bidirectional effect on each other, which means that kids who drink more alcohol tend to get less sleep, and kids who tend to get less sleep tend to drink more alcohol. Alcohol really messes with your sleep in an awful way. It can make you feel like you can get to bed easier. I used to drink in order to manage my anxiety, and I drank a lot at night because I would get anxiety attacks at night when I was trying to fall asleep. When my brain sort of had nothing else to do, it would just act up and get me all anxious. And so the problem is it helps you fall asleep at first, but it really messes with your REM sleep. It makes it so that you wake up in the middle of the night, and in my case, having panic attacks. And so like I said, it's bidirectional. So if you notice your kid is really not getting much sleep, you're going to definitely need to talk to them about that, because that can be for a lot of different reasons. The other thing that parents don't like to think about is change can also mean really rapid or unusual positive change. So for example, if your kid is really depressed or has seemed really down or just hasn't seemed right, and you've been desperate for something to change that, and all of a sudden they're up all the time. And here I'm talking not just necessarily about alcohol, but about other drugs as well. In this country, we have issues with kids using stimulants, amphetamines, Adderall, that kind of thing. And so if your kid is suddenly very happy, very up, you can, instead of just taking that, looking at it and saying, yay, I don't have to do anything, everything's good now. I've been noticing that, you seemed really down for a while and I was really concerned, and you seem happier. What's the reasoning? What's happened? Tell me about the stuff that's happened in your life, because I'm so happy that you're suddenly, feeling much better. So anytime there's a change in my kids in terms of their patterns, practices, behaviors, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to say, even if it's small things, like, for example, Elliott, let's say you come back from that evening out with your friend, and the reason probably that you remember even down to the brand of the drink that this kid used was because we tend to remember, during adolescence, we tend to remember emotional memories really, really well. Like, if you think about it, the days when you just had this perfect day as an adolescent, I can remember specifically feeling this sense of freedom, driving my father's car on a perfect fall day when leaves were falling. I can remember what song was on the radio in the car because it was a real emotional memory. And those tend to stick with us. So that meant that in some way you knew that something was going on here and you were emotionally invested in whatever was going on. But with that kid, if you came home and you were, a little bummed out or worried, and your parents were to say to you, Elliott, what is it about, you go out with this group of friends and you come home seeming a little anxious and concerned. Can you talk to me about that? That's the kind of stuff that is great for parents to do, because that's not about judgment. That's about, I care about you, I love you, and I'm interested in your life, and I'm noticing a change. That's the thing that I recommend that parents, kids, coaches, anyone who works with kids and gets a real bead on how a kid is doing, and suddenly there's change. As a teacher, I know that's what I was looking for in my students. If a student is suddenly falling asleep in class more, or whatever the change is, I'm really concerned about that. But what's interesting about your story is when I started writing the addiction inoculation and I started thinking about the kids that I drank with when I was an adolescent, I looked one of them up, and all I found on her was her obituary, and she died of liver disease. She died from her drinking. She also had mental health issues, and those two things were definitely linked. But she died by drinking herself to death. And if I'd thought about it at the time and I'd watched the patterns and we had stayed friends, although we tend to pull away from friends like that because it makes us feel uncomfortable. And then those kids tend to gravitate towards other kids who aren't made to feel uncomfortable, aka other kids who drink at that level. So noticing that what your friends are doing, and the thing that I hate to tell you is that you actually at that point can't change someone's life. You may have power to sort of like pressure your friends or talk to your friends and talk about your concerns about them. But in the end, it's really important also to realize that even if you had said something to your friend, you didn't have the power to change their drinking. You didn't cause it, and you don't have the power to change it. So you can influence them. You can, put a piece of puzzle in their big puzzle that they're building over time. And maybe that last piece of the puzzle fell into place for them sometime, but maybe it didn't. I don't know. I was lucky enough to have piece 100 fall into my puzzle and I was able to get sober. For some people that never happens, but we're all pieces of their puzzle. And so we hardly ever get to be piece 100. We hardly ever get to be that last piece. It's so nice. I've got to be that last piece once. We are all pieces in their puzzle. And that 100th piece of the puzzle can't fall into place if piece 87 and 62 and 36 weren't there in the first place. Be one of the pieces, but don't expect that you're going to be able to change someone's life just by saying something to them.
I have a very good friend who is an alcoholic. And I'd moved to London from York. I didn't really know very many people, and we were hanging out a lot because we were both single and we were going out drinking all the time. And I hadn't spotted that she was an alcoholic. Other people said to me, look, she's an alcoholic. Anyway, they sort of did an intervention. She ended up checking herself into the Priory because thankfully she, through her work, was able to do that for free. And I went to a meeting at the Priory to see how to help her. And they said, one of the things that really stuck with me, because there was lots of families there of other people that had been through addiction, whether it was drugs or alcohol, was most of the families said, you've got to wait until they hit rock bottom. You can't enable it. You must never enable the drugs or alcohol. So if they're doing that with you, you should never just sit with them. You should always remove yourself to make sure it's very clear that that's not okay. But that for most of them, they'd had to wait until their son, daughter, friend had really hit rock bottom and they had said, no, I'm not going to be there for you until things started to change. There were some really devastating stories in the room, but I've sort of kept that as a thing that you do if you're dealing with somebody who has drugs and alcohol. Would you agree with that, Jessica?
So there's so much controversy over the idea of enabling and rock bottom and where you should draw the line, especially when it comes to parents. Oh, kick him out of the house and let him, then rock bottom will come up faster. I was very fortunate in that I had a lot of not yets. Like my bottom, so to speak, was what some people would refer to as like higher. Like I hadn't lost anything. I hadn't lost my marriage. I hadn't lost my job. My kids were, everything was still there. But for other people, it is going to take, hitting some sort of place that for them is their bottom. And it can be impossible to tell what's going to be. For some people, bottom is death. And that's just the reality. I've been gently talking to a friend who was arrested for a DUI, driving while intoxicated or driving under the influence, and went to jail, has kids, stands to lose, relationships with those kids. And he's not there yet. I'm just going to keep texting just to sort of check in every once in a while, but it's not, again, it's important to realize that you can't control other people's behavior. When it got to the point where my sister and I decided it was time to time really laid down the law with one of our parents, we said, that's it. We were raised with an alcoholic in the family, and we want to protect our children from that. And so we are not going to be bringing the grandkids over. And for a grandparent, that can be their rock bottom. This parent of mine loves their grandchildren so, so much. And for them, understanding that the grandchildren were going to be withheld from them, that was their rock bottom. So it really depends on the person. And the problem is if you impose your understanding of what is going to be their rock bottom, we can't always know what that's going to be. On the other hand, like, for example, let's say I had a niece or nephew that is having problems with drugs or alcohol, then the last thing I'm going to be doing is being the auntie who sends money on their birthday. I'm just not going to do that because I don't want to be giving them spare cash that they could then use for something. So I've done gift certificates, I've done presents of material things, but I'm not going to be giving cash to that kid. If it was my own child, at a certain point, you have to say, I will be there for you as long as you are seeking to get better, but I will not support you in your substance use disorder. We used to call it just addiction, but substance use disorder is the term that we use now. So it's really going to vary on an individual basis. But I think when it comes to friends, it shocks me how few friends are willing to say anything to their friend and stand up. So bravo to your friends who were able to do an intervention. And I've been a part of interventions that were a big flop. It can be hard to tell what someone is going to require. And like I said, I got very, very lucky in that my bottom was very high. I hadn't lost a lot of stuff yet, but I was going to. And I've met people who have lost everything. And it really just depends on where their limit is. And there's a saying in recovery that sometimes you just get sick and tired of being sick and tired. And I was so tired and I was so sick and I just couldn't live that way anymore. And that for me was enough. Enough was enough for me.
Jess, when it comes to parenting, it's really good to get your opinion on this approach. So when I was a young teenager, maybe 13, maybe even younger, maybe 12, 11, around the dinner table on a Sunday, my dad was always very happy to offer me some wine. Always very happy. And I was so smug because I was like, I don't like it. I thought I was like the big man. I don't want to have it. That changed later on in life. But we all know children who experienced the other side of it, where their parents were very restrictive and against alcohol. And I'm sure we all know children who didn't have access to any alcohol and it was kind of stigmatized in the house, and then they went crazy when it was available later on in life. Is it a good thing to offer your young teenage child some wine over Sunday dinner? Is that a good thing to do?
Okay, so there are a couple things I need to address. So this is something I hear a lot. I hear two things. I give sips at home so that my kid won't freak out when it's suddenly available to them. And they're going to do it anyway, so I'll let them do it at home and I'll take their keys away so that everyone will be safe. And that's a harm reduction strategy. I understand where they're coming from. Both of those things are myths. First of all, parents who have a consistent and clear message of no, not until, and some parents might want to say not until it's legal for you, but that's a just because answer. And adolescents are really like a why. They don't like a just because I said so or just because it's legal, because that can be arbitrary, right? So what I say is no, not until your brain is done developing. And giving kids an understanding of why alcohol and drugs are so much more harmful in the adolescent brain is part of that conversation, right? So parents who have a consistent and clear message of no, not until your brain is done developing, have kids with much, much lower levels of substance use disorder over their lifetime. The younger a kid is when they first are initiated into drugs and alcohol, the higher their lifelong risk for developing substance use disorder. So if a kid is in 8th grade, so let's say, 12 to 13, 14, wherever you want to sort of put that in there, when they have their first drug and alcohol, they have a lifelong risk of around 50%, 47% of developing substance use disorder. If you wait 2 more years until they're in 10th grade, till they're like 15, then they have their risk falls by half of developing substance use disorder over their lifetime. It goes down to about 21%. If you wait another 2 years until they're 18, it falls to what it is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 11%, which is what it is sort of in the general population. So the older a kid is, aka the more time their brain has had to develop, the lower their lifelong risk for developing substance use disorder. For the statisticians in the audience, yes, there are confounders in those data, because kids who have access younger in life may live in a home where there's alcohol abuse among the parents, there's more alcohol available, that kind of thing. So yeah, it can be difficult to just sort of nail down those statistics and get rid of those confounders. But that's the best data we have right now. Parents who have a consistent and clear message of no, not until your brain is done developing and it's safer for you to drink, just have kids with lower risk. Whereas parents who have a permissive take on drugs and alcohol, oh, you're going to do it anyway, might as well do it at home. Those parents have raised kids with much, much higher rates of substance use disorder during their lifetime.
And what's the brain development age, did you say? 16?
So the brain goes through two really significant periods of what's called plasticity. It's when the brain is really changing really fast. So there's the 0 to 2 years old, the one like one day they don't know they have feet and the next day they know they have feet, that kind of stuff. And then from puberty until early to mid 20s. So, middle school, high school, early on at university, that's when the brain is most susceptible to the damage that can happen with substance use. And so, for example, I almost didn't put a chapter about college in the addiction inoculation because my take was, why bother? Everyone drinks in college. And then I started digging into the statistics, and it's just not true. In fact, the 72%, this is US data, 72% of all the alcohol that is consumed on college campuses is consumed by a very small fraction of the heaviest drinkers in college. In fact, it's actually quite predictable who will drink in college and who won't. It tends to be males between the age, obviously, of 18 to 24, who are either involved in high contact sports or fans of high contact sports who live off campus or in fraternities or sororities. Those kids tend to drink at higher rates than kids, for example, kids of color, kids, first generation kids in college, kids on financial aid, kids who have outside activities in college, especially those in the creative arts or in religion. So I think our assumption as adults, as parents, is they're going to do it anyway. And that's just not true. It's like 60 some odd % of kids in the US admit that they've had even a sip of alcohol before the end of high school. In 8th grade, less than 21% of kids have had more than a sip of alcohol before the end of 8th grade. So it's not everyone that's doing it. That's just not the case.
So I have to let my dad know he got that one wrong then. He'll be very upset too.
Well, and the other part of that myth is the whole, if it's a forbidden fruit, then kids will go crazy. And I get where that comes from. So I wasn't allowed to have a lot of sugar when I was a kid. So I would go to other kids' houses and I would eat the sugary cereals because we weren't allowed to have it at home. That can happen with some kids, but also I have substance use disorder. So for me, more is more, as opposed to, I've never been like a less is more type of person. For me, that happened to be true. But trying to teach a kid moderation by letting them watch other people drink moderately, it does not work for kids. Because, for example, I can't learn moderation by watching other people be moderate around alcohol. I'm never going to be moderate around alcohol, especially just by watching other people do it. That's just not a part of how my brain reacts differently in the presence of alcohol than people who don't have substance use disorder. Trying to teach a kid moderation by being moderate around them, let alone by not being moderate around them and giving your kids sips, what you do is indoctrinating them into whatever patterns they're seeing in the home anyway. So, and I am not saying, just to finish this off, I'm not saying you can't drink in front of your kids either. What I am saying is that we need to be thinking about the messages that we send kids about why we drink. So if you're coming home from work and saying, I had the worst day at work, I really need a drink, or, we're going to the holidays at grandma's house, there better be a lot of wine because this is going to be a long day. When we say things like that, what we're telling kids is, I'm having a bad emotion that makes me uncomfortable, therefore I will drink at it in order to not feel it. Whereas since I stopped drinking, rather than saying, oh, I'm really anxious about going to this party because I have social anxiety, I'm going to pregame, I'm going to have a little drink before I go. What I have to say now is, I have social anxiety. I wonder what causes my social anxiety and how I can actually deal with that without having to medicate it, without having to squash it down by drinking at it. So let's watch the messaging we have around kids about why we're drinking.
Yeah. So with that, what kind of age do you think is an appropriate time to bring up the conversation about alcohol and drugs with your kids?
So much younger than you think. So the best substance use prevention programs that we know of in the US, ones that have been looked at by outside agencies to test for efficacy, start in pre-K and kindergarten. Start really, really young. And no, you're not talking to kids about, crystal methamphetamine in kindergarten, but what you are saying is, interesting, I wonder why when we brush our teeth, we don't swallow the toothpaste to get the toothpaste in our system. You would think that if it's good on the outside of our teeth, that if we swallowed it, it would be even better, right? It would get in our bodies. But no, because toothpaste is a topical. You put it on your teeth and then you spit it out, because if we swallowed it, it would make our tummies hurt. Or when you're, in the bathroom with your kid brushing your teeth and you say, let's look at this prescription pill bottle that mommy has right here. Can you find the letters of mommy's name on this prescription pill bottle? Well, why do you think mommy's name is even on this prescription pill bottle? Oh, that's because, do you think maybe if you had the same sickness that I had, that you could take my medicine? Of course not. Mommy is different from you, or daddy is different from you. We're different sizes. Our bodies have different, makeup of different chemistry in them because we're different ages. So you should never take medicine that is not prescribed for you. It's, the vast majority of parents in this country know that if their kid is going to get a hold of prescription medications like narcotics and take them, they know that that's going to come either from their own medicine cabinet or from a friend's medicine cabinet. And yet only like 10% of parents talk about the dangers of misusing prescription medications in this country. And that's, we're just sort of afraid to bring it up. So if you start talking from a very young age, it becomes this normalized conversation. I don't happen to teach about sex ed, and so it's still an oogie conversation for me, but I'm sure if I had started talking about it from a very, very young age, that was actually my husband's territory. He's better at that. He's a physician. He's just better at it than I am. So his territory was a lot of the sex ed conversations, and my territory was the substance use conversations. And the more we have these conversations, the easier they get. So in the addiction inoculation, I give scripts for, developmentally appropriate ways to talk about things as, kids are aware of the world around them and what they're seeing in this world, whether it's relative smoking, relative vaping, relatives drinking, relatives drinking to excess. All of those are really important conversations to have, as they're developmentally appropriate.
This has been incredible, Jess. There's so much to digest here. I feel like I need to listen back. And tomorrow I'm going drinking with my friends. So I'll think when I go for that fifth rum and coke, I'll think about this conversation before I order that at the bar.
This conversation is changing globally. I've been so, especially in countries, in the UK, it's really scary to think about trying to change a culture that has been so rooted in alcohol for so long. I mean, even in the US, this culture has really been oriented around alcohol for a long time. But I was in the Middle East recently, and I had been told when I was there years ago not to talk about drugs and alcohol there, that's a private conversation. People don't really talk about that publicly. And then this last time I was here earlier this year, I was encouraged to talk about it, saying that this is a conversation that's beginning to happen publicly. And so even in places where it's a completely verboten discussion, that's changing. And I'm really encouraged by that. It's changing over time.
And for the parents listening, we want to empower parents to understand that they can hopefully have an influence.
Mm-hmm.
What are your tips? I know a lot of your work is around prevention. What are your tips for parents listening to help them to think about the things that they can do to hopefully reduce the likelihood of their child developing an addiction to drugs or alcohol?
So a lot of parents tend to not want to talk about what goes on in our own families. So I come from a family with a long line of substance use disorder. So does my husband. And so that is as important to my children as a topic of conversation and risk factor as knowing that, a couple of their grandparents died of heart disease or stroke, or my father has a problem with his eyes that is genetic. And so I need to know that so that I can get early testing for that. That's really important information. So the more my kids know about their health risks, and substance use disorder is one of those. The risk, when we talk about genetics are about 50 to 60% of the risk picture overall. Trauma and adverse childhood experiences are the other part of it. So my kids, I need for them to have every bit of information for the con side. We have the pros and the cons. Should I drink? Should I not drink? Do I feel like drinking tonight? Do I not feel like drinking tonight? And knowing that they're at a higher risk for substance use disorder, I hope is one of the things that's on that con side and maybe helps them weigh the risk of using a little bit more objectively, right? So keeping that information quiet to preserve, we don't want anyone to know, that's hogwash. We need to start talking to kids about their health risk. That's really important information. It will also not doom them as long as we're having conversations also about other risks, like getting early intervention for things like adverse childhood experiences like neglect, abuse, for kids who experience academic failure or at higher risk for substance use disorder, and especially when that academic failure is stemming from an undiagnosed learning issue. As teachers, we need to be really staying on top of making sure that people know that there are problems going on early with kids. Early childhood aggression is a risk factor. If your kid is aggressive towards other children, social ostracism is a risk factor. So staying on top of those things. Also summers, when kids are not being monitored as much, when they tend to hang out with other teens as, more, that is not a signal to say, ooh, you can never hang out with other teenagers because that will put you at higher risk for substance use. What we do need to do, though, is talk a little bit more at the beginning of the summer about your particular risk factors and ways to say no that don't make you look like a total nerd. In fact, my favorite part of the addiction inoculation weren't ideas that I came up with. I asked adolescents to give me their favorite excuses for not drinking or using when they didn't feel like drinking or using that wouldn't make them feel like a total nerd at a party. And they gave me like 2.5 pages of excuses that they could use that wouldn't make them feel like a dork. And I love that, because if your kid is empowered with what are called refusal skills, then they're going to be a lot more likely to use those refusal skills. It's the reason the word inoculation is in the title of the book, because of inoculation theory, which is essentially giving kids refusal skills and sometimes rehearsing those refusal skills so that they feel like they can really go out there and use them. If an 8th grader knows that very small number of kids drink by the end of 8th grade, and someone comes up to them and says, oh, it's no big deal, everybody does it, and yet in their head they know that's just not true, everybody doesn't do it, then they're going to be a little bit more likely to say, maybe not this time, maybe next time. And that's all we can do for kids. Give them really good information about how it affects their brain development and on a permanent and temporary basis, and how alcohol acts differently in an adolescent's body than it does in an adult's body. Adolescents tend not to understand quite how incapacitated they are and are a lot more likely to get behind the wheel of a car because they'll think, I'm not as drunk as I think I am, whereas an adult might be more able to understand just how drunk they are. Understanding all of those things, giving them really good information, having that conversation early and often, making sure they know that they can trust you to come to you to talk about that stuff without judgment, and that you're going to keep the conversation open, and that you're willing to talk about your own drinking. And, it's hard to talk to kids about healthy drinking patterns when your drinking patterns aren't healthy. So maybe getting a hold of that yourself, getting a grip on that yourself before trying to affect someone else's behavior might be a great thing to do.
Can I ask a very quick question on
Sure.
recreational drugs? I dabbled when I was younger. I say I probably did a bit more than dabbling, actually. I spent, from the age of about 15 to the age of about probably 23, I did quite a lot of speed and quite a lot of ecstasy and MDMA. And I am still friends with lots of the people that I went through that period with. And one of my friends speaks very openly to her kids about those types of drugs. And her theory is she wants them to know that she's been there and done it. And also she would much rather have a conversation with them about how to do those things safely rather than them just go out and try it. Do you think that that's a good approach as well, to just be really open about that, those experiences? Or do you think that might encourage them to do those drugs themselves?
Okay, so that's a yes and no answer. So in addiction inoculation, there was someone who was not willing to be named, and they are a professional person who said, I told my kids about all the drugs that I did in college, and I realized his kid came back to him and said, Dad, you really romanticized this, and you made it so that I really wanted to try those things. And it was kind of a wistful, when I was in college, kind of thing. Whereas, so for example, my husband has done a lot of the drugs that you mentioned. I didn't. I just wasn't into drugs. I think I was really scared of them. But my husband did. And one of the things we talked a lot with our kids is they know that he has. They also know that, the amount of weed that he smoked when he was in between college and graduate school really affected his short-term memory. And he needed all the short-term memory he could get once he got into a graduate program. And that came in super handy recently when my eldest he's in a doctorate program here in economics. And we started talking about, talking about the fact that my husband, who really needed all that short-term memory, cannabis really affects your short-term memory because the receptors for the chemicals in weed that make you high are right there on your hip and next to your hippocampus. And that's why it messes with your short-term memory. And so we had all these conversations about, drug use, especially when you really need your brain. So understanding what kids' goals are a really great way to talk to them about, like, if you want to do X, then it's going to be really important for you to have your brain be fully functional and stuff like that. So don't romanticize the drug use, but definitely help them understand that, why you did these things. There were pros and cons to these things. Because when we say that drugs are just bad, kids are like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would people use drugs if they're all bad? Giving them all the information about what they do to your brain. There's a really wonderful book by David and Nick Sheff called High, and it's oriented toward adolescence. And it's a really, really good book explaining the effects that these drugs and alcohol can have on the brain. Don't romanticize. Do talk about where you were coming from and maybe lean in a little bit on the, any negative side effects that happen to you, like, waking up in a place you didn't know you were going to wake up, or, that kind of stuff, or a hit to your short-term memory, that kind of thing. Those are all a really important part of giving kids balanced information. And I think it's sort of like in the US where we're like, oh, we don't want to talk about birth control because that'll make kids want to have sex more. Well, and that's not true. Just as talking about drugs isn't going to make kids automatically say, oh, drugs, I had no idea they existed. I'm going to run right out and try those things. That's not how this works. It's really important for our kids to have good information. And the more we trust them to manage that good information, the more they feel trusted to make good decisions.
Thank you so much, Jess. This has been incredible. So much rich conversation, so much knowledge. This podcast, we wanted to tackle the difficult topics, the sensitive ones, and I think you've raised so many issues in such a compassionate way. So thank you so much for your time. Is there any final words before we let you go?
I think thinking about parenting is a long-term journey. It's not something that gets a little bit better every single day. Kids are going to screw up. That doesn't mean they're ruined. It doesn't mean you're a terrible parent. It means that you're both willing to learn from the mistakes you make. I mean, this is all, we just want to model for our kids what we want from them, which is to do the best we can with the information we have at the time. If we learn to do better, then do better and explain why we're going to do better. I wrote Addiction Inoculation in between two of my kids hitting adolescence, and I'm parenting my older kid differently than I parented my younger kid. And that's cool because I've explained to my younger kid why the rules changed and the data behind why the rules changed. And, she may roll her eyes, but she also understands that I'm doing it because to do any less than to use best practices would be to say, it's just easier for me if I do it this way, even though I know how to do better. So do the best you can with the information you have. If you learn how to do better, and just keep moving forward.
That's a lovely way to end. Thank you so much, Jess.
You're so welcome.
Thank you so much.